The period of 1967 to 1971 was one of immense social, political, and economic upheavals. Far from the promises of the liberal apologists or petty bourgeois revisionists that there would be decades of peace and stability in which the question of socialist revolution was off the table, the late 1960s proved that the fundamental contradictions of capitalism had not been overcome. In rapid succession, all the economic props established to maintain capitalism in the boom following World War II came crashing down. To understand the late 60s, it is important to place the period within its historical context. Beginning in 1914, the world was beset by more than 30 years of bloody and brutal turmoil. This included the horrors of World War I, a worldwide pandemic, the Great Depression, the rise of fascism, its physical liquidation of the most advanced sections of workers, the Stalinist purges, World War II, and the Holocaust. Europe emerged in 1945 in rack and ruin, with much of the productive forces decimated and vast proportion of the population liquidated in the imperialist slaughter and its consequences. The United States came out of the war as the dominant imperialist power and sought to stabilize the world capitalist order. It was able to accomplish this as capitalism was given the necessary breathing room by the parties of social democracy and, above all, Stalinism. They worked in collaboration with bourgeois governments to suppress and strangle the massive revolutionary movements of workers following the barbarism of the Second World War. The economic basis of this stabilization was due to the extensive damage suffered by European and Asian economies during the war, alongside the economic prowess of American industry resulting from the advancements in productive methods. But this economic revival, which on the surface gave the appearance of immense stability and did lead to an improvement in the social conditions of workers in certain countries, set in motion the very contradictions for its collapse. The post-war period exerted immense political pressures on the Fourth International. The British Trotskyists, the SLL, Socialist Labour League, played the essential role in preserving the lines of continuity of Trotskyism in the late 1950s and 1960s. And as I think some of the lectures have gone through in great detail, the work conducted in this period laid the basis for the development of the International Committee worldwide, including the founding of new sections in the face of opportunist degeneration. In analysing the post-war boom, the late 1960s, and the contradictions present below the surface level appearance, we will be dealing with the issues of political economy, the course of capitalist development, and how the inner contradictions of capitalism lead to collapse. It is necessary to deal with these critical questions to work through the positions advanced by Ernest Mandel. Mandel sought to provide the economic justification of the rejection by Pabloism of the revolutionary role of the working class. He claimed capitalism had reached a new stage in which the imperialist powers had resolved the inner contradictions that resulted in the barbarity of the early 20th century. He initially referred to this new period as Neo-capitalism. To make the central point from the outset, Mandel's embrace of Pabloism did not flow from an incorrect economic theory, but the reverse. His economic analysis was based on his rejection of the revolutionary role of the working class as the gravedigger of capitalism. Mandel was the longtime leader of the revisionist United Secretariat. Born in 1923 in Frankfurt, Germany, he joined the Trotskyist movement in Belgium after the outbreak of the Second World War. Following the war, and still in his early 20s, he, at the time, vehemently opposed any tendencies that suggested there was a progressive role to Stalinism. And certainly Comrade Joe, in his important lecture yesterday, quoted some of the positions Mandel put forward at the time. However, this shifted with the emergence of Pabloism in the late 1940s. Mandel adapted to the restabilization of bourgeois rule after the immediate post-war crisis. We put forward that the contradictions which led to the breakdown of world capitalism in 1914 and which propelled the working class into revolutionary struggles had been overcome. The central justification for this position was that the imperialist powers would never again allow a catastrophic crisis to emerge as it did in the 1930s. He rejected a central tenet of Marxism, that the inner contradictions of capitalism inevitably lead to its collapse. Therefore, flowing from Mandel's analysis, there no longer existed any objective necessity for socialist revolution. In an article published in 1964 for the Annual Socialist Register, Mandel wrote the following, quote, "The necessity of avoiding at all costs a repetition of the 1929 type depression has become a life and death question for capitalism under the conditions of the Cold War and the rise of anti-capitalist forces on a world scale. The techniques of anti-cyclical policies and the redistribution of purchasing power by each individual state are developed on an increasing scale. The state now guarantees, directly and indirectly, private profit in ways that range from concealed subsidies to nationalisation of losses. And this aspect of contemporary capitalism now becomes one of its most notable features," end quote. In other words, the imperialist state is now able to overcome the contradictions of capitalism through a series of checks and balances. It was Keynesianism decked out in Marxist-sounding terminology, that through the intervention of the state, the ruling class was able to regulate the capitalist economy to prevent a breakdown on the scale of the 1930s. This was the economic justification for the liquidationism of Pabloism. The position of Mandel was spelled out perhaps even more clearly in a pamphlet in 1965 entitled A Socialist Strategy for Western Europe, published by the Institute of Workers' Control in Britain, which is an organisation comprising various ex-Stalinists, labour lefts and so-called left sections of the trade union apparatus. And it begins as follows, quote, "The debate over socialist strategy in Western Europe must start from the prior assumption that, during the next decade, there will be neither a world war nor an economic crisis of comparable gravity with that of 1929 and 1933, end quote. Nothing could have more clearly set out the basic perspective of Mandel's revisionism, and that they were directed at the very foundations of Marxism. Because what is the strategy of the Revolutionary Party? It is based on the understanding of the nature of the epoch as one of wars and revolutions, in which the fundamental task of the Revolutionary Party is to prepare the working class for the struggle for political power. Trotsky dealt with this all-important question in the Third International after Lenin. And just as a point, this quote can also be found in the resolution of the Workers' League celebrating the centenary of Trotsky's birth, which was distributed prior to the school. And Trotsky wrote, quote, "The basic principles of revolutionary strategy were naturally formulated since the time when Marxism first put before revolutionary parties of the proletariat the task of the conquest of power on the basis of the class struggle," end quote. Now, the First International was only able to formulate these principles theoretically as capitalism was still in its ascent. But to continue the quote, "The epoch of the Second International led to methods and views according to which, in the notorious expression of Bernstein, the movement is everything, the ultimate goal, nothing. In other words, the strategical task disappeared, becoming dissolved in the day-to-day movement with its partial tactics devoted to the problems of the day. Only the Third International re-established the rights of the revolutionary strategy of communism and completely subordinated the tactical methods to it," end quote. But according to Mandel, the revolutionary epoch which had opened with World War I had ended, and a new period of the peaceful, organic development of capitalism had begun. Never again would the contradictions of capitalism reach such an intensity that the question of political power would be placed on the agenda. In reality, the decade of 1965 to 75 was marked by the most significant economic crisis since the Great Depression of the 1930s and the eruption of a series of class battles. As for the question of nuclear war, Mandel's assertion that it was not a possibility came just 2.5 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, which had brought the world to the brink of nuclear catastrophe. It should also be recalled that the initial expression of Pavlovite liquidationism was the thesis of war revolution, in which a nuclear war between the US and the Soviet Union would be the basis of the socialist transformation, giving rise to centuries of deformed worker states. As Mandel passed on to these new realities he had discovered, there was, of course, no accounting for the perspective with which he had aligned himself little more than a decade before. The essence of the work of Marxism on political economy, grounded on an understanding of the nature of the imperialist epoch, is to penetrate the appearance forms generated by capitalism to disclose the underlying contradictions. Then, on this basis, prepare the vanguard of the working class for the task these contradictions will pose. Tactics must be developed to meet the immediate situation in the development of the class struggle, but they must be grounded on this foundation. Moreover, any analysis of the objective situation is partial, incomplete, and therefore fundamentally flawed unless it includes the development of the class struggle. Most importantly within that, the struggle of the Revolutionary Party to arm and prepare the working class with a revolutionary program and perspective. Whilst all of Mandel's work is devoid of this essential component of Marxism, it was strikingly present in the analysis of the SLL and powerfully exemplified in a major document published in 1961 entitled The World Prospect for Socialism. The document was prepared shortly after the founding of the SLL in 1959, which was grounded in the struggle against Pavlovism. Now, one of the significant weaknesses of the Socialist Workers' Party, SWP, in the United States in the late 1950s was its shift away from the examining of the crisis of capitalism itself. This shift was closely linked to the softening of their opposition to Pavlovism and eventual moves towards reunification. To make the fundamental point, the development of a scientific appraisal of the objective economic situation is only possible if the theoretical work is grounded in a struggle against revisionism. The contents of the documents produced by the SLL in this period were derived from this essential point. Now, what the SLL presented was entirely unique. It sought to penetrate the appearance forms of the post-war boom and show the forces and contradictions that lay beneath these developments. They outlined how these underlying processes would lead to an economic crisis, bringing forward mass struggles that would again pose the question of the taking of political power by the working class. In its analysis, the SLL was refuting the efforts of revisionists such as Mandel, but also it was part of the fight against the moves towards the reunification of the SWP. It begins with a concrete elaboration of the nature of the imperialist epoch analysed by Lenin and Trotsky. Quote, "Capitalism long ago reached the end of its productive contribution to the history of mankind. Already at the beginning of the 20th century, it has been driven into its final stage of imperialism, an epoch of wars and revolutions." End quote. The document continues to outline how the globe, which was divided up between rival capitalist states, came into violent collision in the form of the eruption of the world wars. The ruling classes of these states faced the persistent challenge of their control from the working class both at home and abroad in the form of the national independence movements in the colonies. Far from capitalism being able to assure conditions for a peaceful and stable development, quote, "it manifested a permanent tendency towards decadence and violence, even in relatively peaceful periods," end quote. The SLL continued to explain the phenomena of statisation and the domination of finance capital as witnessed in the years following 1914. It says, quote, "The manifestation of the new epoch in the history of capitalism, even in the most democratic countries, was the growing power of finance capital and monopoly. The synchronization of social and economic life through the medium of the state machine as an instrument of the ruling class and the increasing importance to industry of military contracts," end quote. It made clear that while at particular times and within certain countries, developments may appear to have overcome the inherent problems of capitalism, this was always temporary. What is more, all the temporary mechanisms put in place deepens the contradictions and raises the crises to new heights. As the document states, quote, "The ultimate effect is to deepen social and economic contradictions and heighten the danger to mankind from the continued existence of capitalism," end quote. In dealing with the appearance forms which emerged following the Second World War, the World Prospects Resolution makes the following critical points, which I'll quote in full. It says, quote, "In appearance, the methods of capitalism today, both through the policy of welfare statism in the advanced countries and in the policy of colonial independence, are more peaceful than in the past. In fact, such policies of so-called neo-capitalism have precisely the same end and arise from the same needs as the pre-war resort to fascism and strong-arm methods. The option of creating fascist movements, taking a desperate gamble on the plebeian elements in such movements, is a dangerous one which the bourgeoisie prefers to avoid. It chooses whenever possible to operate through parliament, the bureaucracy, the political parties, and the organised labour movement. Likewise in the colonies, the imperialists fight desperately enough to conserve positions which cannot be held by other means than force. But the world balance of forces makes retention of political control over colonies by repression a course which its intelligent representatives seek to avoid wherever possible." I think this point's critical. They say, "These changes in method do not indicate any change in capitalism itself, nor can it be assumed that the present course is a permanent one, or that the bourgeoisie in the various countries will not, if need arises, resort once again to fascism or use force internationally to preserve or retain threatened positions," end quote. This paragraph is striking in its prescience. Unlike every other political tendency at the time, the SLL was able to deal with the appearance forms of capitalist mode of operation, while also delving deeper to deal with how these appearance forms reveal inherent contradictions. The SLL also drew far-reaching conclusions from the December 1960 and January 1961 Belgium general strike, in which the Belgian government, reacting to the loss of its colony in the Congo, attempted to instigate a series of austerity measures to make Belgium capital more competitive and foist upon the working class the cost of the loss of the colony. This resulted in some 700,000 workers entering into strike action, for which the Belgian government responded by using the police force, the gendarmerie, and even recalled NATO troops. In opposition to every bourgeois economist and revisionist formulations like that of Mandel, the SLL wrote the following, quote, "The prospect for the 60s is not of steady continued expansion, but rather increasing difficulty, a struggle for markets between the main capitalist countries punctuated by recessions and crises. In such conditions, those sections of the capitalist world economy which are least well prepared are certain to experience heavy pressures. Events in Belgium were a foretaste of the kind of problems likely to be experienced and the methods which the ruling class will employ to combat them," end quote. This analysis was closely connected to the struggle against revisionism. The most decisive preparation of the Revolutionary Party in a period where the socialist revolution is off the immediate agenda is the separation of the Marxist, that is Trotskyist tendency, from all forms of opportunism. This is based on the understanding that the party is the key factor in transforming the mass struggles that will erupt into the conscious fight for political power. The work of the SLL in this critical period laid the foundations for the understanding of the complex economic developments that would emerge in the latter period of the 1960s, a period which gave way not only to mass revolutionary movements, but also the crisis of American capitalism. Now, to deal with this, we must look first at the system set up in the post-war period. The two essential planks of the US economic policy following the war was the Bretton Woods monetary system and the Marshall Plan. The former began in 1944 and was the basis of the rebuilding of the world economy. It established the US dollar as the global currency on the basis of the strength of the US economy. It guaranteed that US dollars were convertible to gold at a fixed exchange rate of $35 an ounce. The International Monetary Fund was created to oversee this new financial system. However, it was not enough to establish a new financial system. The commodities produced in the United States needed a market for those commodities to be bought and sold. This question is bound up with the issue of realization in the circuit of capital. The aim of capitalist production is not the production of commodities. This is a means to an end. The circuit of capital is money. Money capital is used in the purchase of commodities, including the commodity of labor power, raw materials, and the means of production. These are then used in turn for the production of commodities in order to extract surplus value from the working class. The realization of this surplus value is through the sale of the commodities which have been produced, turning them into money, so the circuit of capital can resume. This process gives rise to what is known as the realization problem. That is the turning of commodities back into money. It is in the sphere of circulation in which the problem of realization appears. But if commodities cannot be sold or sold at a lower price, this means some of the surplus value in them is not realized. However, it is necessary to go deeper as production, that is the extraction of surplus value, is the driving force of the capitalist system, and any problems of circulation are ultimately rooted there. Marx noted that surplus value produced in one place must be realized in another. He observed that the realization of surplus value is dependent on the existence of other capitalists who can purchase the commodities produced. For example, if capitalists in one industry produce goods without a corresponding demand from other capitalists or consumers, the surplus value generated through production cannot be fully realized. Here we come to the reason why American capitalism had to revive European capitalism after the war. US imperialism had not evolved into a new kind of form in which the inter-imperialist rivalries of the past had been overcome. The surplus value extracted in the United States to be realized, it had to be extracted in Europe to ensure economic expansion and a market for US goods, as well as profitable fields for US investment. For this, the revival of European capitalism was essential, and this was behind the introduction of the Marshall Plan in 1947 and 48. It was recognized that if such a plan was not implemented, Europe would shift into a recession, if not depression, leading to an eruption of working class struggles and threatening to break apart the mechanisms of political stability. This included the role of the Stalinist communist parties, particularly in Italy and France, who had hoisted the discredited bourgeoisie back into the saddle following the war. Another aspect of the Marshall Plan was its all-European character. The productive capacity of European capitalism was lifted with the introduction of US industrial methods, which amplified the rate of exploitation of the working class and increased the mass of surplus value. But this very process meant that the industrial dominance the US enjoyed in the immediate post-war period was being eroded, a process analysed by the SLL in 1961. It noted that the revival of the European economy saw a relative growth in the political bargaining power of the European ruling class on the one hand, and witnessed a series of new economic consequences, unlike those of the past, on the other. To quote, a sharp reflection of this has been the weakening of the dollar as a result of the large and continuing balance of payment deficits over the past 2 years. The vulnerability of the dollar reflects, in part, the greater strength of other currencies, especially the mark, as well as the world commitments of American strategy involving higher military expenditures and aid to underdeveloped countries. High interest rates in European centres has also led to transfer of funds and these speculative movements have become frenzied when dollar devaluation has seemed likely, as it happened between July and September 1960, further contributing to the difficulties of the dollar, end quote. The SLL made the point that at this stage it would be incorrect to suggest the imminent decline of American capitalism as a world force. It nevertheless raised that, quote, the inability of the US economy to grow rapidly or dispense with massive arms spending show that even the strongest capitalism is in crisis, end quote. Critical to the analysis in the 1961 document was that the identification of the role of revolutionary leadership. France had emerged from World War II as the sick man of Europe. The placing of de Gaulle in power, playing something of the part of a Bonaparte leader in the Fifth Republic, was a regime in crisis. In the United States, it identified signs of breaks in the ice block in key layers of society, identifying the various trends that were emerging through petty bourgeois bohemia and radicalization of the youth, particularly in the universities. It also made particular note of the emerging civil rights movements. But above all, it noted that the outstanding factor in the American situation is the role of the Marxist Party. It pointed to the immense political responsibility placed on the shoulders of the SWP and that its responsibilities, quote, cannot be fulfilled without absolute clarity and a firm political line. Continuing, the revolutionaries in the SWP need periodically check over their own political work against these dangers. In a position of relative political isolation, of constant battle against the current, a diversion from the true cause can creep up unexpectedly. A search for a shorter way, for alliances which may impose accommodation to alien trends, for regroupment without solid theoretical bases, for programmatic adaptations to suit what are assumed to be American peculiarities. These have constantly derailed American socialists in the period since 1917. The attention of the leaders of the SWP must be constantly directed to such dangers as they may affect their own policy and thinking, end quote. The political line of the SLL and the attention paid to these critical political and theoretical questions prevented the liquidation of the Trotskyist movement under the pressures of Pabloism. It was the training and reworking of these critical lessons, including on the understanding of the contradictions present in the post-war boom, that formed part of the basis of the founding of the Workers' League in 1966 and the RCL in 1968. However, this in no way ended the question of the pressures of the post-war boom and the contradictions it presented. Mandel, having embraced Pabloism and growing into one of its chief ideologues in the sphere of political economy, became one of the most prominently read and referred to revisionists on university campuses. In this period, the SLL would continually come under attack for catastrophe mongering and exaggeration. Yet by the late 1960s, the contradictions identified by the SLL came to a head. After the full implementation of Bretton Woods' system in 1958 and the full convertibility of the English pound to the dollar, the City of London was instrumental in creating what became known as the euro-dollar market, which formed the birthplace of the global financial system today. In November 1967, due to a balance of payment deficit in which Britain was spending more on imports than exports, the government of Prime Minister Harold Wilson sought to devalue the pound to make British exports more attractive to the international markets. This triggered a run against the dollar as investors sought to exchange their dollars for gold, as they saw gold as a safer store of value, putting massive pressure on US gold reserves. By 1968, the gold pool crisis emerged, in which the gold markets were closed for several weeks as the agreed upon price of gold, which is the very center of the new financial system of Bretton Woods, was threatened. Anticipating the 1971 removal of the gold backing, the markets reopened with a new two-tier system, allowing for greater flexibility in gold pricing. Then in 1971, the gold-dollar link was broken. President Richard Nixon responded to the pressures of an ever-decreasing balance of trade, which actually went into the negative, by removing the gold backing on the dollar. The central plank of the Bretton Woods monetary system was ended. Now, this was to avoid the development of a major crisis of US capitalism. The only way of maintaining Bretton Woods would have been to lift interest rates in the US, which would have induced a flow of dollars back into the United States financial markets. However, this would have triggered a recession in both US and Europe. Under conditions where the working class was coming forward in a series of increasingly militant struggles, this would have produced a major and provoked a major political crisis. In this short period, all the claims that capitalism had entered a new period essentially were blown apart. However, this was not the occasion for Mandel to reassess his economic analysis. On the contrary, he moved further to the right. This is because his analysis flowed above all from a rejection of the revolutionary role of the working class. In a paper delivered to the 1968 Socialist Scholars Conference at Rutgers University, Mandel spelled out how the term neo-capitalism was not merely some terminological invocation, but involved the development of an entirely new historical perspective. Quote, "Some European politicians and sociologists speak about neo-capitalism in the sense that society had shed some of the basic characteristics of capitalism. I deny this most categorically and therefore attach the term neo-capitalism the opposite connotation, a society which has all the basic elements of classical Marxism." Then he goes on to say, "Nevertheless, I am quite convinced that starting either with the Great Depression of 1929-32 or with the Second World War, capitalism entered a third stage in its development, which is as different from monopoly capitalism described by Lenin, Hilferding, and others, as monopoly capitalism was different from classical 19th century laissez-faire capitalism." We have here a complete rejection of the fundamental understanding of the nature of the imperialist epoch, as analysed by Lenin and one of the foundational tenets of the Fourth International. Lenin analysed that in its economic essence, imperialism is monopoly capitalism. This definition of imperialism was linked to the task facing the party. He drew out that underlying the development of monopoly was the socialisation of production, not merely the interlocking of firms, and that, quote, "Private economic and private property relations constitute a shell which no longer fits its contents, a shell which must inevitably decay if its removal is artificially delayed, a shell which may remain in a state of decay for a very long period if, at worst, the cure of the opportunist abscess is protracted, but which will inevitably be removed." End quote. The difference between imperialism and the competitive capitalism of Marx's day was that previously it could have been seen that while socialism would have been more advantageous, capitalism still had a progressive role to play in the development of the productive forces. Now the overthrow of capitalism had become an historical necessity. The material basis for socialism was established in the socialized production of monopoly capitalism, that is, imperialism, which constituted the transition to a higher socio-economic order. According to Mandel, however, neo-capitalism was as different from imperialism as imperialism itself was different from competitive capitalism. In other words, the opportunists of Lenin's day were correct. The Russian Revolution had been premature. There was no objective foundation for the program pursued by Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Now, this perspective also contains a rejection of the Marxist theory of breakdown, the theory that the inherent contradictions of the capitalist mode of production would inevitably reach such a point that a situation would arise which would place before the working class the possibility and the necessity of the conquest of political power. Now, we've got to deal with this question, I think, in some more detail. Comrade David North, in chapter 30 of The Heritage We Defend, that's page 410, makes the following point, quote, "It is an axiom of Marxist political economy that the movement of the inner contradictions of the capitalist mode of production leads inexorably to its collapse. If that is denied, then there no longer exists any objective necessity for socialism," end quote. Central to this analysis of the historic crisis of capitalism is the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. And Marx spent a great deal of time dealing with this central question, as he characterized it as the most important law of political economy from an historical point of view. The inherent tendency for the rate of profit to decline over time as capitalism develops is bound up with the very process of wealth accumulation. The capitalist class seeks to accumulate more wealth and achieve higher profits, which is derived from the extraction of surplus value from the working class. To increase productivity and profits, capitalists invest in new technology and machinery. This leads to an increasing in organic composition of capital. This refers to the ratios between constant capital, that is machinery, raw materials, etc., required for production, and variable capital, the cost of labour power. As these new technologies are introduced, the proportion of constant capital in the total capital investment grows compared to variable capital. The sole source of surplus value, that is profits, is the living labour of the working class. But this living labour forms an increasingly smaller portion of the total capital which it must expand. Consequently, the rate of profit tends to decline as there is more capital tied up in constant capital, which does not provide additional value, while the growth of surplus value cannot keep pace with the expanding capital. This necessitates and compels the capitalist class to attempt a mass restructuring of production. This takes the form of profound crises in which large-scale areas of production are smashed up. The 31 years between 1914 and 1945 were a graphic example of this process, as the productive forces of Europe and Asia were reduced to rubble. We also witnessed this process at the end of the 1970s and 80s, in which you had the mass restructuring of production, which produced globalization. This was done through a series of shocks and catastrophic tearing apart of old areas of industry, creating, for example, the American Rust Belt. This is also a process we're witnessing today, as the ruling class seeks to use artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, to overcome this tendency of the rate of profit to decline, utilizing new forms of technology, not for the benefit of mankind, but to find mechanisms to extract further profits. Now, Marx succinctly characterized this process when he wrote in the Grundrisse, quote, "These contradictions lead to explosion, cataclysms, crises, in which by the momentaneous suspension of labour and annihilation of a great portion of capital, the latter is violently led back to the point where it is enabled to go on fully enjoying its productive power without committing suicide," end quote. Now, working over this process inherent in capitalism does enable an understanding of the complex developments happening below the surface, which saw the eruption of the class struggle in the late 1960s, something which took all the revisionists by surprise. Only the SLL had analysed and prepared for such a development, working over and outlining the complex contradictions following World War II. The post-war boom was based on a growth of the productive forces. This meant that greater surplus value was extracted from the working class. This surplus value enabled the bourgeoisie to grant certain concessions to the working class in the form of social welfare and government spending on health and education, etc. But it also gave rise to the increase in constant capital in relation to variable capital and set in motion a falling rate of profit. The downward trend in profit rate began in the middle to late 1960s and accelerated thereafter. The initial reaction of capital was to seek to increase the rate of exploitation within the existing regime of production. However, this led to increased militancy in the working class because the boom had seen the growth of large-scale concentration of workers and a powerful growth in their organisation. This explains the explosion of the class struggle internationally in the late 1960s as militant sections of workers rebelled against the attempts by the ruling class to impose speed-ups and introduce new state mechanisms to suppress the wage struggles and overcome the falling rate of profits. And just to give one example of this process in the United States, in the addition to the removal of the gold backing, the Nixon administration announced the formation of a wages board to set a limit on wage rises of 10%. Now, such was the rising militancy of the US working class that this was denounced by George Meany, the head of the AFL-CIO at the time, as a move to fascism. Now, as the previous lectures have gone through, the period of 1968 to 1971 was one of immense class struggle, the highest expression of which was in France, the sick man of Europe, with the May-June 1968 general strike. It brought the entire French economy to a halt and placed front and centre the question of revolution back on the table of Europe. It was the prelude to the largest working class offensive seen since the Second World War. And just to touch on a few of the developments, you had in 1969 in West Germany a series of strikes known as the September strikes, led by thousands of metal workers, which brought whole sections of industry to a standstill. Meanwhile, Italy experienced what became known as the Hot Autumn, characterized by a surge of labour strikes, protests and social unrest. In Poland and Czechoslovakia, during the Prague Spring, workers rebelled against the Stalinist dictatorship. In the United States, this period witnessed immense strike action, with railway workers, miners, teachers on strike, and wildcat strikes of postal workers, as well as large-scale urban riots across the country. The beginning of 1968 saw the Tet Offensive of the North Vietnam forces, which not only caught the US and South Vietnamese off guard, but it shattered the conception of the almighty strength of US imperialism. This fueled mass anti-war protests, which were only deepened by the revelations of the reprisals brutally enacted against the North Vietnamese people by the United States. This was sharply brought to light in the exposure of the My Lai massacre, published by Seymour Hersh in 1969. Now, as the lecture by Comrade Tomas went through, you also saw in September 1970 in Chile the election of the Allende's Popular Unity Coalition, which was brought to power by an increasingly militant working class. To make the point, even before the election, workers were occupying factories, establishing workers' committees, while peasants had taken over large estates. The prospect of socialist revolution was on the table in South America, considered the backyard of the United States. Now, a critical document produced by the SLL entitled The Dollar Crisis provides a detailed summation of the analysis of the British Trotskyists in this period. In the draft resolution presented to the Central Committee, published in 1973, entitled The Development of the Post-War Economic and Financial Crisis, certainly penned by Jerry Healy, the SLL made clear that what was taking place was an insoluble crisis of capitalism. To quote, it was a vindication of the struggle waged by the International Committee against all the brands of anti-Marxist revisionism. And as it was written, quote, throughout the last 28 years or more, it has been the revisionists, led by the so-called United Secretariat, who've preached the theory of neo-capitalism. According to this spurious anti-Marxist theory, capitalism in the post-war period has changed fundamentally, end quote. The document goes on to analyse the Bretton Woods monetary system and how the crisis arose out of its contradictions. As the SLL writes, quote, the eruption of the present crisis has proved once more the soundness of Trotsky's judgment that no matter how strong American capitalism appears, the contradictions of imperialism were even stronger, end quote. The crisis in the early 1970s was the result of the accumulated value on outstanding credit, which had reached as high as double the US gold hoard. The SLL writes, quote, no matter how much the revisionists sneered at the analysis of the monetary crisis made by the SLL, gold and commodities are tied together inseparably. This was the whole purpose of Marx's analysis in Capital, a work which all these gentlemen said was now out of date. Now the correctness of its analysis haunts every capitalist financial centre and banking house throughout the world, end quote. The SLL insisted that this was not a conjunctural downturn, but represented a fundamental crisis of capitalism. This lay in the overproduction of capital in the form of mountains of parasitic paper claims on the ever-diminishing profit rate of the US economy. That is, under conditions of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. And to quote, all the institutions of Bretton Woods have for the last 25 years or more been employed to build up a huge superstructure of credit. The vast majority of trade has not been carried out with either gold or dollars, but through credits arranged against the dollar. These credit institutions have been in turn being used to invest in machinery and equipment on a huge scale throughout the capitalist world. In this process, share values have been inflated beyond their remotest connections with their real value. Now, this hugely inflated volume of capital must seek to earn its rate of profit through the exploitation of labour power. But not even the most brutal increase in the rate of exploitation of the working class of Europe and America can solve this crisis for the capitalists, although, of course, they must be driven to attempt a solution in this direction. Only the violent elimination of capital values on a vast scale can now restore the correct proportions between the pool of constant capital and the available surplus extracted from the working class, end quote. And this was precisely what was being prepared and was later carried out. And it did take some time for the bourgeoisie to restabilize its rule in the crisis period of the 1960s and 70s, and they relied directly on the Stalinist social democracy and the trade union bureaucracy, all chiefly allied and supported by Pabloism. Having done so, it launched an international offensive against the working class, the ferocity of which was driven by the need of global capitalism to overcome the downturn in the rate of profit, not only by defeating the working class, but by the restructure of the economy. Now, finally, the document warned that what was being witnessed was the operation of the law of value, quote, as an objective law which asserts itself against both classes. It is, in a sense, seeking its violent revenge for the last 25 years in which the capitalist class and its revisionists and reformist hangers-on have tried to ignore it or wished it away. And like all laws of social development, it does not operate in a smooth manner, nor in one which can be anticipated beforehand, but only in the most convulsive way, end quote. The recognition of the objective nature of this crisis gave way to an analysis of the revolutionary nature of the period. And herein lies the enduring significance of the work of the SLL on political economy. Against all the nostrums of the Pabloites, such as Mandel, that a new era of capitalism had dawned. It told a new generation of workers and youth that the contradictions of this system leading to its breakdown had not been overcome. By drawing this out, it summoned them to fight for the program of world socialist revolution. Now, the reaction of the petty bourgeois intelligentsia to this period was to move to the right, as Comrade Peter went through in his lecture. At the very moment when the working class demonstrated its revolutionary capacity in the French general strike of 1968, a section of the middle-class academics reacted in horror, a process traced out by Comrade David North on page and reflected in page 214 of the Frankfurt School, Postmodernism and the Politics of the Pseudo-Left. Just to quote, he says, in May-June 1968, the petty bourgeois intelligentsia looked over the abyss and they were terrified. Their brush with revolution set in motion a sharp movement to the right, end quote. The various so-called new philosophers which emerged embrace anti-communism under the banner of human rights. Other sections who had previously identified themselves as left repudiated classical Marxism. In its place was the embrace of the irrational, subjective idealism of postmodernism and the obsession with individual identity. Mandel's work in this period reflects this shift. This can be seen in his book Late Capitalism, in essence his new term for Neo-capitalism, published first in 1972. Now, I will apologise. These next quotes, as they always are when it comes to theoreticians of postmodernism, are long, obtuse, and certainly will be difficult, I'm sure, for the AI translation, but there's only two of them, so we'll bear through it. Quote, and this is from Mandel from Late Capitalism. The growing contradiction between objectively socialized labor and private appropriation is determined not only by the third technological revolution, the increasing necessity of highly qualified labour and the widening cultural and political horizon of the working class, but also by the gulf between potential abundance on the one hand and actual alienation and rarefication on the other. Whereas in the age of classical capitalism, the main impulse for workers' struggles came from the tension between the present and the past, today it lies in the tension between the actual and the possible, end quote. I mean, this passage makes clear the further shift in class orientation and perspective underlying Mandel's never-ending attempt to counterpose the post-war period to classical capitalism and classical imperialism. Now the issue of socialist transformation of society arose from a comparison between the actual situation and what would be possible if the productive forces were developed in a rational manner. Mandel's standpoint was not that the proletariat was a revolutionary force in society, but sections of the petty bourgeoisie who would be the agent of socialist transformation due to their outrage by the excesses and irrationalities of the capitalist system. In Mandel's worldview, even sections of the bourgeoisie itself would come to see the necessity of the rational reorganization of society. And here we have the last quote. Set against potential abundance and possible development of the creative powers of the individual, the growing fatigue with senseless production of inferior goods, the widespread sentiment of anxiety amongst workers and capitalists alike, resulting from the suspension of spontaneous self-activity and the spread of generalized insecurity, with the compulsion to conform and to succeed characteristic of bourgeois society, the increasing solitude of social life and frustration with advertising and product differentiation, the deteriorating state of mass transport, the decay of housing conditions and the strangulation of large cities are becoming increasingly unbearable. At the very moment when the self-development of the social individual will be incomparably easier to achieve than ever before, its realization seems to be receding ever further away, end quote. In this paragraph, one can see the shift towards the theoreticians of postmodernism, identity politics, and Marcusean emphasis on psychological factors. Everything becomes filtered through the lens of the individual, of self-development, personal frustrations with life under capitalism. The working class, having already been deemed no longer a revolutionary force, is pushed aside for the whims of a layer of the middle class moving further to the right. This is under conditions of and a reaction to the greatest revolutionary movement of workers since the crisis following the Second World War. In contrast, the International Committee sought to trace out a path for the working class and prepare the struggle for power. The British Trotskyists paid particular attention to the perspectives and analysis being developed by the Workers' League in this period. In a letter sent by Mike Bander to Tim Woolforth, the National Secretary of the Workers' League at the time, dated February 1973, Bander sought to draw out an understanding of the unfolding liquidity crisis in the United States. Now, this was written around the same time as the dollar crisis was being worked on and published, and can be found on page 233 of Trotskyism versus Revisionism, Volume 7. In Bander's note, he pointed out that the deficit accumulated by the US was, quote, considered indispensable for the functioning of the Bretton Woods system, end quote. It was required for European nations to transform their export surpluses into liquid dollar holdings. However, the international source of this liquidity was the dollar, which became the Achilles heel of the IMF. In the late 1950s, the deficit reached mammoth proportions, near the $3 billion mark. This investment, Bander wrote, was directly related to the fall in profit rates in the USA and the huge growth of parasitic paper claims on an ever-diminishing profit rate in the US economy. And here the quote's on screen. He says, but the crunch began when, simultaneously with the increase in US investment in the European central banks, But the crunch began when, simultaneously with the increase in US investment, the European central banks began to change their inflationary dollars into gold. This was the direct result of the deficit, which in turn was supposed to be the sine qua non, or indispensable requirement, of monetary stability. Consequently, the US stock of gold fell from about $25 billion in 1950 to $10.5 billion in 1968, end quote. Vander pointed out two important conclusions from this process. One, that the accumulated dollar liabilities are twice the US gold hoard, which has led to a crisis of confidence, causing more conversions to gold, in turn exacerbating the crisis. And two, this coincides with an insufficient gold supply to meet the requirements of the IMF. The only way to overcome this is for countries to increase dollar holdings, further increasing the US deficit in the balance of payment. It was these two intersecting processes that the US sought to overcome through the ending of the gold backing for the dollar and the introduction of a series of new economic measures under the Nixon administration. This would have a profound impact on economic trade and conditions in countries throughout the world. Vander warned at the end of his letter of any conception that developments in the US would only proceed on the basis of leaps, and that central to the orientation of the working class was the difficult and sometimes protracted struggle against opportunism. To quote, he said, "To conceive of the developments in the US as proceeding only by leaps is wrong and dangerously so. There will not only be leaps, but also plenty of hard, unspectacular slogging against the Stalinists and revisionists, which will require great theoretical firmness and tactical skill," end quote. Just 1 year after the letter to Woolforth and the publication of The Dollar Crisis, the explosion the SLL had predicted erupted in Britain with the British miners' strike in 1974. It was the accumulation of a series of increasingly militant struggles of workers in the early 1970s in opposition to rising inflation and the attempt to reverse the wages and conditions of workers by the Conservative Tory government of Prime Minister Edward Heath. The strike began February 9th that year in opposition to the attempt to impose a wage freeze by the Heath government, when there were mass pickets, clashes with police and blackouts as a result of the disruption of coal. The Heath government responded with a snap election in the hope that it could win support to use state violence to smash up the strike. Instead, the strike continued through the election, garnering further support, which then led to the coming to power of a minority Labor government. So profound was the tensions that sections of the ruling elite considered declaring a state of emergency and overthrowing the government after Heath's defeat. This revolutionary period had been anticipated by the SLL. However, at this stage, the SLL had begun to step back from the unspectacular slogging against revisionism. And I think the lecture just delivered by Comrade Sam and Peter really does detail this. This was seen obviously in the founding of the Workers' Revolutionary Party in November 1973, which proceeded without a discussion in the IC or a thorough review of the lessons of the struggle against Pabloism. Its program adapted to the growing anti-Tory sentiment, focusing almost entirely on the ousting of the Heath government and the bringing in of Labor. The realisation of this perspective just 4 months after its founding produced profound problems for the WRP leadership. However, I think the point must be stressed that the opportunist degeneration of the SLL-WRP did not proceed in a straight line. The essential political clarification of the post-war period was fundamental in the training of the cadre of the International Committee. Reviewing the economic political analysis of the SLL after 1971, it became almost exclusively focused on the monetary system, the removal of the gold backing from the US dollar, rather than the tracing out how the dollar-gold crisis was resolved and how this resolution itself gave rise to developments of new contradictions. However, the Workers' League sought to develop, deepen and extend the analysis of the SLL on the significance of the collapse of the Bretton Woods Agreement. It sought to trace out the relationship between the developments in the economic base of capitalist society and the class struggle as it developed in the US and internationally. This was present in its 1978 Perspectives Resolution, which makes the fundamental point, quote, "The product of the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944 was not the planned, managed and organised capitalism as claimed ad nauseum by Keynesian economists and revisionists, but rather a financial Frankenstein now totally out of control, end quote. Has to be said, this Frankenstein monster has grown in leaps and bounds since the 1970s and reared its head in a series of crises in the recent period. Turning to the development of the class struggle, the Workers' League perspective pointed to the significance of the 111-day miners' strike in 1978 and their defiance of the Taft-Hartley Act. It was the result of this confrontation which, as the resolution states, exposed the desperate weakness of the ruling class. The response by US President Carter was to appoint Paul Volcker as Fed chairman, where he was to play a central role in the class war launched under the Reagan administration. The resolution drew attention to the connection between the dollar crisis and the fall in the rate of profit, which marked the end of the post-war boom. Quote, "The dollar crisis has greatly exacerbated the falling rate of profit in basic industry, which, in turn, makes US imperialism less able to satisfy the huge claim of a mountain of paper credit being made on a relatively diminishing amount of surplus value in industry," end quote. The development of what the resolution called the Great Dollar Printing Machine led to inflation of around 12% and fueled the development of the class struggle, sounding alarm bells in ruling circles. And in the document, there's a choice quote from an article in Business Week where they say, quote, "The US is still a long way from open class warfare, but many people worry about what happens if inflation remains at anything approaching recent levels. Now the economic outlook is clouded. Inflation is no longer waning, and this country could be headed for the worst period of economic and social dislocation since the Civil War," end quote. What confronted US capitalism was that its most basic problems, notably the decline in the rate of profit, could not be resolved within the post-war industrial framework. What was required was a fundamental restructuring of economic and class relations. This was the significance of the measures instigated under Reagan. The Volcker measures, driving up interest rates to as high as 20%, brought on the deepest recession since the Great Depression, a battering ram against the working class. Whole sections of US industry were forced to close that had developed since industrialization of the latter part of the 19th century and for the first 3/4 of the 20th, expanding during the post-war boom. This restructuring involved the development of computerized methods of production and the development of globalized production to take advantage of cheap labor. However, none of this would have been achieved but for the collaboration of the trade union bureaucracy. Now, the Workers' League analysis deepened what was identified by the SLL, that the question of value had not been overcome. Rather, it continued to raise its head in all the increasing storms that erupt in the financial system up to and including today. We are now in a period in which the breakdown of capitalism has reached a new point where once again the struggle for power is being placed on the agenda. As the New Year's Perspective document published on the WSWS detail, the accumulated pressure of the, quote, "intersecting elements of the world capitalist crisis attain the equivalent of a critical mass. That is, they have reached the point where the dynamic of crisis has passed beyond the ability of governments to control the movement towards a social cataclysm," end quote. The issue is not whether revolutionary struggles will develop, but whether a revolutionary leadership is built. That involves the assimilation of the lessons of the history of the Fourth International and, above all, of the critical struggle conducted by the ICFI against the crucial prop of the bourgeois order, that is, Pabloism. Thank you, comrades.